Good evening, everyone. My name is Mariana Wertzman, and I'm a librarian here at the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library. Today, we have a treat of a program for you. It's Sabor, Judío, the Jewish-Mexican cookbook, a conversation with authors Margaret Boyle and Ilan Stavans. If you don't already have a library card, please talk to some of my colleagues and definitely get one. Before I introduce today's speakers, I would like to thank the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library for making programs like this possible. It is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers, Margaret Boyle and Ilan Stavans. Margaret Boyle is the Director of Latin American, Caribbean, and Latinx Studies at Boyden College and Associate Professor of Romance Languages and Literatures. A Jewish Mexican-American from Los Angeles, her teaching and research focuses on Hispanic women's literary and cultural history, comedia history and performance, and health, humanities, including medical, spiritual, and food cultures. Her books include Unruly Women, Performance, Penitence, and Punishment in Early Modern Spain, and Health and Healing in the Early Modern Iberian World, a Gendered Perspective. Margaret founded founded and currently directs Multicultural Mainers, an elementary world languages and cultures program. Ilan Stavans is an award-winning, internationally renowned researcher, teacher, essayist, translator, and a cultural critic, and a longtime friend of the library, I must add. He is the publisher of Restless Books, a Louis Sebring Professor of Humanities, Latin American and Latino Culture at Elmhurst College, and a consultant to the Oxford English Dictionary. He has been the recipient of many honors and has translated books into numerous languages and adapted them into film, television, and radio. Born in Mexico City, he currently resides in Elmhurst, Massachusetts. Without much ado, please welcome Margaret and Ilan.
Hello, everybody. Hola.
Hola a todos. Gracias por estar con nosotros. And thank you so much to the New York Public Library. We are so thrilled to be here and to celebrate this beautiful book with you.
Un gran placer estar contigo, Margaret, and it's a joy. It's a particular. I've been involved with the New York Public Library for many years, and it's just wonderful to see, not on Zoom, but in real life, and that is that they exist. Many of the people that I spend so many months, time after time, it's a joy.
I'm glad that you are talking about Zoom, because I think so much of this cookbook we created in these intense conversations through a Zoom screen. But I thought it might be fun for us to start talking about how this book came to life, even before the pandemic.
This book has a mythical origin. It has a mythical origin both for me and for Margaret, and I'll now speak obviously on my behalf. Maybe about 2 years ago, just as my mother was being swept away by Alzheimer's oblivion, she managed literally at the very end to send me a PDF of a document that I know existed, but I thought it had disappeared over time, and I wasn't paying much attention to it. It was a reproduction of a recipe book that had started with my immigrant Yiddish-speaking maternal grandmother, my mother's mother, in Poland, as she traveled from the old world to the new world. And so this book contained recipes in Yiddish, of desserts, of gefilte fish, of all kinds of things. And it became a testament and a chronicle of the age of immigration for her and for many others. Ashkenazi Jews arrived into Mexico roughly between 1880 and 1920, 1930. They were not the first Jews to arrive to Mexico. During the colonial period, Jews that had been expelled from the Spanish, from the Iberian Peninsula in 1492, had come to what was then New Spain, Nueva España, as secret Jews, crypto Jews, and between the early 1500s and the Mexican Revolution in 1810, and certainly by the time the Ashkenazi Jews arrived, many of them had vanished. They had assimilated, they had left little trace, except that we know from letters and from other documents that they cooked secretly for Shabbat, for Passover, for Yom Kippur, and some of those recipes had to adapt elements from Mexico. When my Ashkenazi family arrived, this document became a kind of window into the challenges that she and others like her faced of not having the same type of fish that she was buying in Warsaw, or the spices and all kinds of other things. And as a result, there are comments all over, and it's crossed out. And you can literally see, as she is learning the Spanish words in the book, she's inserting them, and there's a competition between the Yiddish language and the Spanish language. It's exquisite. My mother inherited that. The women in the family are the ones that have driven the culture by doing all these recipes. And my mother added to my grandmother's, her own recipes. So I was absolutely enthralled when I got this, and I immediately told it to Margaret, who had a similar story.
And so now I can share my story. I first met Ilan, I think it was maybe 2016. I invited him to Bowdoin College, where I work, up in Maine. We have an annual Jewish studies lecture, and I happened to be teaching about Don Quixote that year. And Ilan had just published a graphic novel bilingual adaptation of the text. And I wanted him to come up and speak about Don Quixote, but also about the representation of converso Jews in that text and in that time period. And it was in those informal conversations, probably around early modern books, because that's where I like to spend time, that we found that we had these kind of similar family histories. And I shared that I also had this manuscript document. So in my case, I grew up in Los Angeles, and my mom was born in Mexico City and moved to the United States when she was a child, and actually went back to Mexico. And my own childhood was kind of going back and forth between the US and Mexico to get to know this family. The person I spent a lot of time with that I loved so much was my great-grandmother. I was really lucky that she was alive until I was in high school. And at that time, most of that time, my Spanish was not great, and her English was not great. And we talked to each other through food. And my aunt was the person who held on to her recipes, and it turned out all of these members of my family had been trying to document what she was writing, and she wrote some things herself. And just like Ilan, there were all these kind of family conversations and revisions between how the dishes were prepared in Mexico, how they were prepared in the US, and the time period for these two manuscripts are almost the same. So my great-grandmother Malka came from Poland to Mexico City in the 1920s, and I think for both of us, our family arrived on ships, and maybe they would have gone to the US, but we were in a period with the quotas where it was not easy to get into this country, and Mexico was a place that was welcoming so many Jewish people.
And so as a result, you have two scholars with two family manuscripts that have a unique symbolic but also a historical value. And we shared them, we talked about them. And then I thought that I had to pay tribute to the women in my family, and just being with Margaret was
I remind him of that.
a wonderful opportunity. I thought that it would be a good idea to reach out to other women of the Mexican Jewish community.
And men, we reached out to.
And what?
And men.
And men. Yeah, I should probably expand the pool here. We put an ad in the Diario Judío. It's the big online organ of the Jewish community, asking people if they had recipes, and literally were inundated with many that had to do with different holidays, they were favorites, cookies or desserts, or for the desayuno, breakfast, or the comida, lunch, or the cena. And it became clear that the community, the community calls itself La Comunidad. La Comunidad had a statement here that wanted to coalesce, and that the two of us, in some ways, as historians, as cultural commentators, were the bridge, the tools for this to happen. I should add at this point that I personally became absolutely fascinated with the idea, not only that this was what was happening in Mexico, but that it was pushing me to think, and we talked a lot about this, Margaret, of what makes Jewish food Jewish. In many of the diasporas, Jews arrive with elements from the previous diaspora as immigrants, and then they create a fusion that becomes a statement of the encounter of the past with the present. And what we immediately found in the recipes that ended up in Sabor Judío is that these are elements that have a lot of Polish, Ukrainian, Russian, Belarusian elements, but have now been adapted, incorporated into the taste and flavors of the Mexican cuisine, with salsas and with different types of picantes, with mango and other types of fruits. And this was done absolutely organically, naturally, as I imagine that the first Jewish settlers in Ashkenaz in the 13th century or 14th century began for the very first time trying what would become gefilte fish or herring, and thinking, what is this exactly? And eventually adopting and adapting them as their own food. And I will stop here, Margaret, just by trying to bring us all to think that though we are in the middle, as frequently as is the case, of an immigration debate about this country, people are not the only ones that travel. The tastes travel, the dreams travel, the ideas travel. And when we get an onslaught of Mexicans or Venezuelans or Argentinians, we're also getting the flavors that are coming with them and that are now going to crystallize in the new environment. You want me to carry on, or back to you?
Oh, I wanted to talk about process for a minute.
Sure.
So when we received all of these recipes from Diario Judío, they, as you can imagine, they were in an array of languages. So we received some in Spanish, we received some in Yiddish, we received others that were in Hebrew. And so I think one of our first steps was to kind of sit down, translate, get a sense of what we had in front of us, and then invite a whole team of people into the process to make some decisions about what it would mean to form a collection. And we decided on 100 recipes to be representative of what we were defining as both what is Jewish food and what is Mexican food. And Ilan has also talked a lot about the kind of Ashkenazi wave that is representative of both of our family traditions. But I think another value that was important to us was to think about Sephardic history too, and Mizrahi history too, to think about the diversity within Jewish culture.
Because just as before the Ashkenazi Jews, there had been a migration. I hesitate calling it a Jewish migration, because during the colonial period of Mexico, many of those that were escaping the Spanish Inquisition arrived without identifying as Jews, hiding instead because of the pressure of the Spanish Inquisition. And so they kept their identity secret, but they didn't keep their tastes secret. They certainly passed them on from generation to generation, and there are records of the crypto-Jews, the Anusim, the conversos, the marranos. There's a whole typology of how to call them that shows how they would choose fish, for instance, for Shabbat, or certain types of rice and potatoes for Yom Kippur. And they could not utter the word Yom Kippur, but through a secret language that passed on, they would be able to convey what it was. And when one goes to certain cemeteries, Catholic cemeteries, in New Mexico, Santa Fe, Albuquerque, in Nevada, certain parts of Mexico, you can still see tombstones that have Stars of David or hands in this form or a lion, in which I believe the dead are communicating with the next generation, passing on the message that there is something that continues here. And then simultaneous with the Ashkenazi immigration between 1880 and 1930, there's the Sephardic immigration, the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, Greece, the former Yugoslavia, collapses. Many of those that live in Istanbul, in Aleppo, in Beirut, come to Peru, come to Mexico, come to Argentina with that food. It's fascinating in the history of Mexican Jewish, in Jewish Mexican history, that for the very first time, Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews are coexisting in the same neighborhood, downtown Mexico, without speaking the same language. Some of them speak Yiddish, some of them speak French. Their liturgy is different, how they celebrate the rituals, and yet there's something that unites them. And then there are two other waves that come. One is of survivors that come immediately after the Second World War, and during the Second World War, many people don't know that Latin America became a magnet of both Nazis, Bolivia, Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, and also survivors or refugees, Cuba, the Dominican Republic in particular, Puerto Rico, Mexico, and then also the Israelis that came in the 1960s and 70s, marrying Latin American Jews, brought falafels and brought trina and hummus and all kinds of things. So the book is a kind of mishmash, well organized, of the different Jewish Mexican cuisines.
And so I think something in our mishmash is this idea of recipes that have this long and beautiful history, and that's something that was important to both of us. So we're these converso recipes with a story, and sometimes we take a recipe as an excuse to share with our readers our love for some of these individuals from the 16th and 17th century. Ilan was talking about conversos, and one of my favorite details about him is that he wrote poems on avocado pits during the Inquisition. So, like, if I'm just imagining these connections between identity and food, like, that's just such a beautiful physical example. So there's these old recipes, but there are also these people who are alive right now in Mexico City, all across the country, in the United States, and we do a lot of work to try to tell some of their stories. So we have, for example, Patty Heenich, who you may have seen on Patty's Mexican Table. She is one of 3 matzo ball recipe contributors in this book. There is a woman named Karen Drahansky who runs a couple of restaurants in Mexico that's named Nido, that's based on Mexican Jewish food, but actually.
And they happen to be all cousins of yours, no? Or second
I learned this in the researching of the book, so that was an amazing little bit of detail. But now I have concrete proof about why my great-grandmother was such a good cook, because it really did just run in the family. And then in addition to these kind of restaurateurs, we have contemporary writers from the Mexican Jewish tradition sharing some of their family recipes. So Miriam Moscona.
Angelina Muñiz. Yeah. And so this book tries to do a bunch of different things simultaneously. I think you've gotten that message. It's a cookbook, and the recipes are really superb. We spend a lot of time cooking them with our respective spouses, improving, hopefully, all of them. And then we had a terrific friend, Leah Koenig, who's herself.
It was amazing.
Amazing. And she tried all the recipes and helped us standardize them. One of the things, as a historian of recipes, that you quickly find out is that your bobe, this is the way she would say, you put some potatoes and a little bit of sugar and a little bit of honey, and just pray that it will come out the right way. And as
we didn't think that you guys would want to cook that way.
As generations go, you standardize, how many spoons, how much of this, how much of that, and that is an interesting development. And the other part also is that the book wants to be a statement of this rich and diverse, colorful, and now very contemporary Mexican Jewish community who happens to have a female president that is Jewish. I always thought the United States would have this before, a woman president. Maybe this is going to be the year.
It's
a
trend.
That we will have 2 women leading. I mean, high time for something like this. But Mexico already has one. Claudia Sheinbaum was elected a few months ago. She is part Sephardic, part Ashkenazi. She herself is reluctant to...
Yeah, a secular Jew.
A secular Jew, and to identify openly about it. The Jewish community keeps a certain distance from her because mainly of her politics. The Jewish community, she is to the left of Bernie Sanders. And so the Mexican Jewish community tends to go more into the center right. Something like that. But it's a wonderful development, and it's even more so that in the research I also found out that she grew up 3 blocks away from me. It's just that there are 6 Jews in the world, and we're all in this room in some ways. Let me just say one more thing. My beloved wife Allison is somewhere here, over there, and though she's not Mexican, she has perfected the Mexican Jewish tastes in a way that she created something some years ago that has become a staple of our holidays, latkes with mole for Hanukkah. And it was an incredible idea, has become very popular. It's in the book. In fact, it's in the back. The photograph is in the back of the book. And so one of the conversations that Allison and I frequently have, it goes more or less like this. Ilan, that's not Jewish Mexican. And I say, well, Jewish Mexican is whatever a Jew and a Mexican are cooking together at that particular moment. And if they add a little chile piquin, or she smiles. Okay. Her latkes with mole are just divine.
I have not tried Allison's preparation, but I've heard a lot about it, and so I'm hopeful that maybe this winter I can try them. I will give a shout out to my husband, who is also an incredible latke preparer and pleases our young daughters every winter. And what I appreciate about him is that he's willing to let our kitchen get very messy. I would love to just share a little bit more about the structure of this book. So I think we've said the 100 recipes. It's organized by kind of the day, a kind of standard Mexican day. So desayuno, breakfast, comida, a big meal that would happen in the middle of the day. And then we have a postres or sobremesa at the end, which are kind of sweets and drinks. And then we have another section that are tied to holiday celebrations. For each of the holidays, we also were really intentional about giving an introduction to what the holiday is and the many ways that it's celebrated across homes, because we want the book to be enjoyed by Jewish people, non-Jewish people, inviting people in.
And maybe as we get ready to open it up to people to ask and reflect and suggest, I would say too that this book comes at a time when both Mexican culture in the United States, it's a book written in English, it will be translated into Spanish, but the first audience is in English, has finally entered the middle class and is much more a fixture of American society that even when I arrived to this country in the mid-'80s, where in spite of the fact that Mexicans had been here even before the country was a country, there was this resistance in different parts of it as if we Mexicans were not fully it. And the astonishing thing is that if there is a question of what makes Jewish food Jewish, there is equally a question of what makes American food American. And probably the most important answer is that American food is the food that Americans eat, and Americans and immigrants from all parts of the world. Mexican food has become astonishingly present in the United States. In Amherst, I think there are more Mexican restaurants than Mexicans. And I'm sure it's not the only...
That's definitely true in Maine.
Yeah, it's not unique. Many of the people that work in the Mexican restaurant are not Mexicans, but there's one in particular, one of these restaurants that has a unique story, Margaret. I've never told it to you. A friend of mine, Martin Carrera, wanted to do in the 80s as authentic a Mexican restaurant in Amherst, Massachusetts, a godforsaken place, as imaginable. And he swore never to have a burrito, because burritos are little donkeys in Spanish. The word means little donkey, and the burrito is really a Tex-Mex concoction that Mexicans look with suspicion. He opened it with the little money that he had, and nobody would come. And those that would come would always ask for a burrito. And it was a strategy of survival that he had to introduce the burrito with the authentic Mexican twist that he was giving to other food. And the funny part is that one goes to Mexico now and you can eat burritos because they have now been imported. Mexican food has been imported from the United States to Mexico. And Taco Bell is popular in Mexico. That to me is almost, I don't know. I don't have words for that. But compared or in relation to that, Jewish food also in the United States is incredibly popular, and it goes in many directions with the delis and the different types of food that one serves. So I love the fact that these two ethnic groups, these two minority groups, are now getting married. There's a shidduch between the two of them, and I think it's bashert. It's the word in Yiddish for it was meant to be this way. And this food is Mexican and Jewish, but not fully Mexican and not fully Jewish. It's kind of a mishmash that is truly that fusion of the two cultures.
But what I've learned, I think, through this process is that there are many of us that are mishmashes, and what that lets us think about kind of bigger concepts like diaspora and preservation and all these foods that we carry around.
Yeah. So let's open it up to people. We're not cooking on this occasion. We have a bunch of events, but there's no oven here or refrigerator, but would love to hear. There's a microphone that is going around, and please.
Woohoo! Okay. You should definitely check out that Conan episode where he smuggles himself into Mexico and he brings a suitcase worth of Taco Bell, just in case he gets hungry. I just wanted to say that you have this lovely page in the book about Shabbat. And my wife and I have started doing Shabbat for these last 3 months, and it's been incredibly special. We light candles, no prayers, but we go around the table, we say what we're grateful for, and we make sure that there's no TV and no cell phones. That's really changed the game for us by helping us connect with each other and through the food. I'm just wondering if the two of you did Shabbat as kids or as parents, and what kind of traditions you had and what it meant to you.
Beautiful. Margaret, you go first.
Yeah. So I would celebrate Shabbat not regularly as a kid. It was a kind of a special treat if we would go to more like grandparents or an aunt and uncle. It was not a regular part of my growing up. I think I started celebrating Shabbat more regularly when I went to college. And I think I talk about this in the book a little bit, this awakening of like, oh, I am a Jewish person. Oh, I am a Mexican person. And what does that mean? And I would cook Shabbat dinners with other students on campus. And there's a grad student, a friend that I went to grad school with, I see in the back, that I know I invited him over to my house for Shabbat as a way of kind of slowing down and getting to chat with the people that I really care about. And now, as a parent, Shabbat is a huge part of, I want to say, parenting philosophy that's much older than that. But the idea that we are also not regularly saying prayers, but that we'll cook a delicious meal, slow down, change the pace, and have more time together.
I second that, and I celebrate the question. There's something that happens to all of us when we become parents, that time and space and just the texture of life changes. I feel that texture when sometimes you can see a day and say it's moving like Sunday, or it has the energy of a Thursday evening. And to me, the texture of Shabbat is really unique. There's some aspect that permeates it all. I come from a Yiddishist family. This means that my ancestors believed that Yiddish was a religion, that they needed to pass Yiddish to the next generation, and that in doing so, the next generation would be part of a secular, non-religious approach to an ancestral culture that navigated through time. I went to Yiddish school. Yiddish was my first language. Spanish was the language of the street. There was a dichotomy between how to communicate with Bobe and Zede in one language and then how to play soccer in another language. And though they didn't believe in the divine aspect of Shabbat, they believed in the flavors of Shabbat. They believed in the rhythms of Shabbat. And I remember going to my Bobe Miriam on Shabbat, and she would light the candles. She was much more religious than my mother would be. And the way she would move the hands, and the challah next to it, and next to it some salsa or cajeta that we would eat next to. So for me, that the mix of the two. As I became a parent myself, I wanted to project that to my kids, and it's the cultural side that I think both kids have. They both think of themselves. I'm speaking on their behalf, and they probably will shoot me as I leave this building, but they feel Mexican Jewish in those flavors, in those tastes, in the rhythms of music, in how the Mexican soccer team plays better than the American. But Shabbat is unique, and the Shabbat in Mexico is different than the Shabbat in the United States. And we all reinvent it in one way or another. Beautiful question.
I'm curious if you can speak a little bit about how you adapted some of the older recipes to now. I think about, I once spent some time looking through my mother's sisterhood cookbooks from the 1980s, and there are styles of how people used to cook that we just don't do anymore. Like I would never ever make one of those recipes today. So when people were sending you all those things, how did you figure out how to adapt it for now?
Yes, so it's interesting because we think like, oh, the 1980s and whatever was fashionable in that moment, we wouldn't cook it now. And so we didn't have those moments. And then we had recipes that were so much older, like the 17th and 18th century, that, so there's one, I'll share one detail. There's a recipe in the book for an eggplant that's stuffed with lamb, and it has all of these kind of floral kind of touches infused through it. So there's lavender and there's some rose water, and I think there's some rosemary too. And there's the mouthfeel of that recipe is actually really strange, I think, to us. But we actually intentionally left it the way that we think it should have been prepared, and kind of advise you, prepare yourself for a different mouthfeel. In other cases, we didn't need to have a recipe with Cool Whip, or we got a lot of recipes for sushi cake, which from the Mexican Jews, which was amazing. And I think that was like a late 1990s fashion. So we made some choices about what to include and not. The eggplant we included because there was a good story, like the symbolism of the recipe that justified the weird taste.
And then you have the dishes that when you finally try them, you say, duh, this is as old as the Bible. Of course, it was just created 30 or 40 years ago. Brisket tacos. I mean, a brisket taco is just succulent. It has the perfect taste. You need to have different types of either salsa or guacamole or a brisket torta. Gefilte fish without salsa now doesn't taste like gefilte fish. But you can do it with pico de gallo, you can do it with green salsa, you can do it with mole, you can do it with this, with that. And ghettoizing hummus only for a falafel? No, you can do hummus with all kinds of other dishes that are Mexican too. So you can have as aperitivos guacamole and the hummuses and a little tahina, but then you have other types of salsas. There's a lot of improvisation. I remember when my parents, maybe 30 years ago, wrote to me and said, the United Nations, or I don't know, I think it's the United Nations, declared Mexican food a heritage of humanity. I'm not getting it totally right, but you get my point. And they were so proud that this was not only the food of Mexico and Mexicans, this was an aspect of the heritage of the world. And it does feel like that. Mexican food is incredibly versatile. And you go to the north, and it tastes very different than when you go to Chiapas or when you go to Oaxaca, or even within Mexico City. You are in Las Lomas, and a taco tastes totally different than in Coyoacán. You need to know where you're going and who is behind it. So the variety onto its own of Mexican food is exquisite. And then you add all these ingredients of Jewish food. But I don't think it has to be seen that way. It's the variety of Jewish food, and you have all the ingredients of the Mexican food. It's really balanced between the two. It's the second generation, not the immigrants, but the children of the immigrants that became more daring in the fusion. And the third generation that became probably excessively daring, so that you don't really need to respect this as Polish. Now it's part of everything. So you can see the different waves of how people have adapted things over time. And I think that's immigration. That's assimilation. That is what culture is about, those transformations.
So I'm curious, when you got multiple recipes that were similar or recipes for the same dish, how you picked, because I know that there can be a lot of very impassioned disagreement over whose brisket recipe is the best.
Yes.
It's my mom's.
No, it's Allison's.
But
It's
so-
Allison's. You haven't
It's
tried
my
Allison's.
grandmother's.
So how when you found, a dish that you liked and you wanted to include it, how did you narrow down to the one recipe that you included?
Yeah, I love that question, and it reminds me of something that happened early in the process that was like another sign that we were meant to be working together. So both in my family manuscript collection and Ilan's, we have this recipe for cinnamon beer cookies, and they both use Modelo beer, and they are actually almost identical recipes,
The two grandmothers didn't know each other.
we think.
We think. It's 6 Jews.
But in that case, there was a little bit of variation, but it was Ilan and I that could say on behalf of our family that we could make some changes. Other times we would go back to the people when we knew they would be a part of the book and ask permission sometimes for making changes and have a little bit of conversation about why we were removing something or why we were combining things. Ilan just talked about the brisket tacos that are another amazing, delicious recipe in the book. It's topped with this rhubarb sauce that is often served with a different brisket preparation, but we found that when you top it on the tacos, you have the kind of like sweet and spicy come together in a way that we thought, okay, this is the recipe that's living here.
And sometimes we couldn't agree. So we put 2 the recipes.
That's true. That's why we have 3 matzo ball soups.
Yes, and 2 briskets, and 100 is a good number for that. You can be flexible. But the other part is that I say this is the first cookbook that I do. I've done other types of books, graphic novels and translations and other things. And I always, before this, I always said that it's far more interesting to write the book than to see it finished and read it afterwards. Just how it's like a puzzle. You put it all together, and so much of your mental and emotional energy goes to preparing it the right way. All that is exponentially so with a cookbook. The cooking of the recipes that we would do, the dialogue with the people back and forth. Then we went to Mexico and people invited us to their homes and cooked for us to show how it was done.
And I will just say there are photographs of some of the people who opened their kitchens to us or their restaurants to us. There's a beautiful picture of a baker. He was making pita, and then he, like unprompted by us, revealed that he was a mariachi singer. And then he did a demonstration for us, and it was just unbelievable. Like we couldn't have paid money to make that happen.
And then there are the redeeming qualities of something like this. I can't stand Manischewitz wine. It's like cough medicine.
And I have strong attachment to it from being a 13-year-old, getting the little cup.
And so what you have in the book is Manischewitz paletas, which are really delicious. And it's the only way to have Manischewitz, in my view. Sorry, Margaret.
Ilan gets mad when I say that I'm nostalgic for Manischewitz.
If you're nostalgic for Manischewitz, oh my God. Yes, there are. Do they need to be in the microphone, or they can just?
Yeah, so we can hear them for the recording.
There are
Okay, hi. Thank you very much for the book and for your presentation here tonight. I always think of other books when I think of books, and the only other book that I thought of with yours, and I'm asking you what, if any, positive or negative influence it had on you, was that about 30 years ago, the mezuzah and the Madonna's foot, which involved more, I think, the religious. It wasn't culinary. Yeah. What, if anything, you would have to say about that?
I thank you so much. When I think of books, I think of more books and more books. Books have this astonishing quality of talking to each other when we don't pay attention. When the library closes, they are communicating with themselves. And I, I, I think that in many ways, a book that comes out new is the byproduct of the dialogue that many books have had among each other. And you serve as a midwife in some ways to bring it along. I remember reading that book. I wasn't thinking of that book when I put this one together, but I was thinking of for instance, I was thinking of the tortured journey of Frida Kahlo in Diego Rivera. Frida Kahlo, who claimed her father was Jewish, but he wasn't. And yet, because she claimed he was Jewish, she defined herself as a Jew. Diego Rivera believed that he descended from conversos, from secret Jews. In some of his murals in Mexico, when you see them, he has hidden messages, and sometimes not so hidden. Those messages appear there. And you know, there are histories and stories of what they cooked for themselves, and they are part of the book, though they might be tortured Jews. I mean, tortured Jews is Jews. All of us are tortured Jews. And I in many ways, I think that I want to make it clear that it's the Jewish community, but the Jewish community is, even though it's 40,000 people strong, there are people who want to be part of it. There are people who don't want to be part of it. There are people who identified as this, that other. And there are 40,000 Jews and 45,000 synagogues. No, almost, but a lot of them. And so there's a lot of peripheral elements of other books, other stories that really impacted us and wanted the book to reflect them. There is a story, the Peter Jennings or Dan Rather of Mexico during the worst dictatorial years of the Partido Revolucionario Institucional was Jacobo Zabludowski, a Polish Jew, he was the only newscaster, and the Mexican president would tell him the news that he needed to deliver that night. And if the Mexican president told him, you can't talk about this, Zabludowski would not talk about that. And many people hated Zabludowski for that reason. He's in the book. There are others that have been historians, that have been poets, that have been novelists, that are also in the book, cooks. The book tries to reflect the many books that have come before and the many people that make that complex, amorphous community, la comunidad of Mexican Jews.
And I will just kind of briefly add that I think for both of us, we are literary oriented and want to talk about books all the time. And at a certain point, I remember our editors having to remind us that this book is about food and not books, because we just found books everywhere. But you see both of us fighting with kind of the libraries that all of these foods are carrying around. So there's poetry in some of the recipe descriptions, or you'll find that the recipe is carried around by the author, and then it shows up in her fiction. And so we try to tell you some of those stories and then bring it back to the food.
I have one back here.
Sure.
Hola, buenas noches.
Hola.
Yeah. So I assume that all the recipes in this cookbook are kashrut friendly.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so we call it kosherissimo. Everything can be prepared kosher style. We wanted to make it that people who are observant can prepare everything in the book. And at the same time, we were trying to keep things open and accessible for people who are not as committed to having a kosher kitchen.
I was also going to add on. So are a lot of these recipes like also like I guess for lack of a better term, regional variants of kosher Mexican cuisine? And if so, which regions are more fleischig friendly and which ones are more milkshake friendly?
Oh, I don't know if fleischig and milkshake, those are the dairy and the meat, for those of you who don't know Japanese, no, that's Yiddish or Hebrew. There are recipes representative of Oaxaca, of Chiapas, of the north, a lot of recipes from Ottoman immigrants who came from to different parts, and so we identify where they lived. The vast majority of Mexican Jews today live in Mexico City, Guadalajara, Monterrey, and Cancun. But there are others that live in other parts, particularly in the US-Mexican border, like El Paso and Juarez and other places. There are no kosher butchers in all of these places. There are several in Mexico City, a bunch in Guadalajara. I believe there's a new one in Cancun. There is a new Hasidic Lubavitcher presence in Cancun, and also has been around in Guadalajara and in Monterrey. So that is, those circles connect much more with the butchers or with a particular type of cooking.
Sorry, I'll just jump in to say that I think we see like kosher tourism happening more popularly in Mexico in the last 10 years. And then Ilan had talked about this younger generation that's becoming more religious in Mexico City who have supported the creation of kosher restaurants, for example.
There's a lot recently, just to second what Margaret was saying, because of kind of ethnic or boutique tourism, you can now go to Mexico and stay 7 days and go to all the Jewish places and eat only Jewish food that will be prepared for you. Or you can go on a cruise and only eat Mexican Jewish food. There is a lot of that new approach to bringing people, and it depends on the constituency, if it's going to be only kosher or kosher style, etc. There's in the book, as Margaret was saying, a kind of typology of kosher style, and what we Mexican Jews call kosherísimo, which generally is not kosher, but dreams of being kosher.
Hi, so I'm curious, with Rosh Hashanah starting next Wednesday night, what will you be cooking?
Yes. You want to mention?
Yeah, so there's a coffee honey cake that is in this book that I make every single year, and I'm excited to make it with my kids. I'm also going to be at the college at Bowdoin where I work with a whole bunch of college students and working with dining to help prepare a meal. They successfully made the delicious brisket tacos, so I'm hoping to revive that. And they made nopales, a cactus salad for the second time in the history of the college. So I want to also support that coming back.
If you, the part that Margaret was mentioning toward the end of the book, there's the Jewish holidays, and it gives you the recipes of what Mexican Jews eat on those holidays.
Or suggestions.
My grandmother, Miriam, the one that I've been mentioning, would cook a fish, Veracruzana style, which is from the Gulf of Mexico, that was with tomato, onion, and olives. It just brings me back to that Rosh Hashanah table. 35 people, cousins, screaming and shouting. But the moment the pescado a la Veracruzana would arrive, silence would descend. Everybody would sit dutifully in their table, and we would just devour it. That is one of it.
And I will just say that's a really common Mexican dish, pescado a la Veracruzana. But I think it's so beautiful too because it's referencing the port of Veracruz, where our families immigrated, and so many families immigrated. But I don't think that's a common part of the culture.
Right. Veracruz is to Mexican Jews what Ellis Island is to American Jews.
You were talking about your recipes, that some of them are very old. And I was just wondering if you, when you were testing the recipes, whether you were honouring the traditional way that those things were made, because obviously back in the day people were, you know, doing everything by hand and whatever. So I was just wondering, when you were testing recipes, were you actually changing the technique, or you stuck to the original technique, or?
Yeah, so for this book, we really wanted to keep things accessible for a modern kitchen. I came to wanting to work about recipes because I actually love preserving these old styles. And so for a couple of the recipes that are in the book, I have experimented with what does it look like to use the dishes that were available or these kinds of preparation techniques, but we knew that wasn't practical for this particular book. So we try to do some storytelling, but then make it easy for you.
There's a lot of how it was cooked in the head note. There's a lot of how it was cooked, and I'll give you two examples. Well, because we are scholars and book freaks, we talked. Not all of it ended up in the book. What we talked about, I remember talking at one point of having gone to see a Shakespeare play. I think 12th Night, where everything that was on stage belonged to when the play was written, and nothing was extemporaneous, including the lights, the textiles that were used, the color, the way of coloring the textiles. So you got everything historically accurate. It wasn't a great show, but it was historically accurate. We talked a lot about bringing it to the present and then trying to reflect through the narrative some of the past. And just because I can't avoid not telling you the story, there is a terrific 5-minute video called Gefilte Fish of 3 women that cook gefilte fish. It's American. The grandmother who tells you how she goes in the morning and buys the cheapest fish at the market and uses her hands and all the hours. Then the daughter comes in, the grandmother is not there, and she says she's using the cuisine art. It's the new technology. And then the last one, the granddaughter, who says she just buys Manischewitz and puts it on the table. You can see the 3 generations going through it.
Why do you think Mexico is so open to the Jewish community?
Why? Excellent question. I'll tell you what I think. Mexicans have a huge heart. Mexicans have been opened to many different cultures. During the Spanish Civil War, Mexico was the place to go by those that were escaping Franco. During the Argentinian Dirty War, Mexico was the place to go. So I like to think that Mexicans have been incredibly generous to Jews, and I am both a witness and a vivid incarnation of that. My gratitude for Mexico is unending, but I think that in spite of what you can or cannot see on social media, it's really a tradition of the country, of being open to different cultures, and the Mexican cuisine is an expression of many of those influences. There's Japanese influence, there's French influence, there is Russian influence, and the Jewish influence. I think Mexico is an incredibly open place that is very receptive to other parts of the world.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, it's a question, but you're Buenas noches.
Buenas noches.
I wanted to know, considering that both of you are scholars and you love books, did you find any interesting literature mention about food, Jewish Mexican food, in tales or books that you included in your book?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I mentioned at the beginning that we highlight some mostly women writers who are so important in Jewish Mexican culture today. So Miriam Moscona is a poet who writes about kind of Sephardic family traditions and has done kind of beautiful biographical memoir. And so we have a recipe that she has for tarator, which is a yogurt-based cold soup that she talks about also in the literature. And we see that, I think, there's several examples throughout the book.
I'll give you one. Si hablas español, seguramente la vas a reconocer mejor. I'm going to switch to Spanish. It's the United States, so. Sor Juana era nieta de conversos. Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz was a granddaughter of conversos. Sor Juana is the greatest poet of the colonial period. And Sor Juana was the administrator of her convent, the treasurer, and also the one that kept the recipe book of the cafeteria. I don't think it was called cafeteria, but whatever it was called, the dining room. We have a recetario de Sor Juana.
It's almost all sweets.
Yeah, it's almost all sweets, and there are parts that are one of the recipes
They're
is in the book.
buñuelos that are in the book.
And there's a moment where Sor Juana, in her autobiography, if you haven't read Sor Juana, I'll buy you the book. It's incredible. She has in her autobiography, in her defensa, where she's defending herself against her confessor who's asking her to give up the writing of poetry. She says that had Aristotle lived in the kitchen the way women live in the kitchen, he would have written far better philosophy than he did. And it's such an eloquent section of that book, and a celebration of philosophy and the life of recipes. She is another example that we have.
I think she's our shared superhero.
So, absolutamente sí.
And I'm just noticing the time.
So, muchísimas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias por
Toda
estar
Rabá,
y
thank you,
celebrar.
al großen Dank, in every language. Enjoy the recipes if you're going to open the book, and if not, you'll miss something really delicious. Muy sabroso. Muchas gracias. Hasta luego.